This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hello and welcome to Writers on Film. My name is John Bleasdale. I am a writer and film critic, and today I'm going to be talking to Jonathan Melville, who is the author of a book which was one of my favourite, author of a book about a film that was one of my favourite films as I was growing up. It was kind of one of those films that a lot of people, I think, maybe keep as a little bit of a dirty secret. You know that phrase that is sometimes used, guilty pleasure. The film is Highlander. The book is called A Kind of Magic, Making the Original Highlander. And it is a making of book which goes into great depth and great detail about the making of what became a kind of cult classic, starring Christophe Lambert, Sean Connery, and Clancy Brown as the Kurgan. It's a really great read, and our conversation goes into a lot of it. If you enjoyed the episode, please remember to tweet, to like, to subscribe. If you could leave a review, that would be really good, or if you could leave a rating, especially if it's a good one, that would be really good also. You can also, if you wish, follow me on Twitter at Dr.Jonty, DRJONTY. But before you do any of that, enjoy the conversation.
Saw it when I went to university, so I was I would have been probably 18, maybe 19 in 1994. Well, I would have been 18 then in 1994. So yeah, went to here in Edinburgh. We've got a cinema called the Cameo, which is a very old cinema, but they had lots of double bills late night, I guess mainly for students, which I was at the time. And I saw a double bill with The Crow.
Oh, right, yeah. You mentioned this in the book as well. Yeah. That's kind of a perfect double bill as well.
Totally, yeah. Whoever programmed that did an amazing job. Because The Crow was brand new. That was just, or recent anyway, very recent that year. So obviously this was maybe just a way to get it seen by a few more people and, introduce people to something that at that point was 8 years old, I guess it was.
Yeah,
my math is not great, but that's a pretty easy one. Yeah, 8 years old.
8 years old.
Yeah, it was just hard to believe it was ever new or 8 years old, just because we're so far away from it now. But yeah, it wasn't that old at that time, but I think it felt a bit older. I mean, I can't remember.
I was going to say, did it feel like the 80s? Did you sort of feel a sort of retro feel to it when you watched it? Or
I think so. I mean, I think I remember the style, and I remember that vision that Russell Mulcahy, the director, had, and just the look of it. And I remember the transitions. I remember that first one in particular when it goes from the parking lot up into to Scotland, and that even watching that now it's impressive. But yeah, so that definitely struck me. But I think at the time it did feel, even then, a few years old, because I guess special effects had moved on a little bit since the mid-80s. Yeah, so but it obviously struck a chord with me, because here we are talking about a book, which at the time I'd never thought I'd be writing books, even though I was doing publishing. Admittedly, the course was publishing a degree, but right. That was more publishing other people's books than writing my own.
So what was the impetus to get you to write about Highlander? What was the thing that you thought, I've got to write a book here?
Well, I'd written a book previously on Tremors, right. Which originally I wrote an article for SFX magazine here in the UK, a sort of sci-fi fantasy magazine, about the 21st anniversary of Tremors, and I think that was around about 2011 or so. And I'd interviewed one of the writers and co-creators. So that led to me writing a book in 2015. And so when that came to an end, I was kind of exhausted, really, because creating anything can be tiring. And writing a book, this one, it took me kind of three-ish years maybe. So that was lots of late nights and early mornings and lots of interviews. I did about 55 interviews for the Tremors one, all of it through Skype because everyone was in America. But but I think by the end of it, I was just like, that's me. I'm going to just take a break now. And that would have been 2015 when it came out. And then in 2016, I don't know, I can't quite put my finger on what it was exactly that made me think Highlander, but I think it was just speaking to people, maybe my partner as well, she might have suggested it. I think we were sort of looking at films, and it's also just thinking about films. I mean, I love films, so at that time I was writing for the local newspaper here in Edinburgh and blogging about films and going on the radio. So I was doing that all the time. So I suppose it was just in my world, I was in that world. And so you're also looking for things that nobody else has written about. And so Highlander, Tremors, no one had written a Tremors book. Highlander, there's just certain films I think that, I don't know, people just don't, it's not so much they don't write films about them because I ended up doing it, but they maybe just aren't the most obvious ones. And Tremors was a slightly more unusual one because it's kind of a quirky, this quirky kind of fun comedy, sci-fi, horror, romance. No one quite knows what it is. And Highlander, I don't think anyone had written about it at that point, apart from there's lots of blogs and things online and newspaper articles. So, but then round about that time, actually, I can't remember, I think I'd thought about writing it, and then I read that someone else was writing a book on all the films. And so I did think, right, that's not going to work then. You can't really, although there are multiple films and things like Casablanca or, horror films, maybe the Halloween films, there might be multiple books on those, certainly the big classics. I thought there's maybe only room in this world for one book on Highlander. And then, so I bought the book on Highlander, this other book on Highlander, and it wasn't what I would have written. And the chap that wrote it, John Mosby, who I now know, he wrote, I think his first chapter, or his chapter dedicated to the first film, was maybe something like 19 pages or 20 pages or something like that. And although there was a lot of detail in that, I thought, surely there's more to this world. So anyway, I started looking into it. I'll try and get to the point quickly. But I started looking into it. I started emailing the likes of Christopher Lambert and Clancy Brown and Sean Connery, and this would have been 2016, just the start of 2016. And then round about, none of them got back to me. And then in early 2016, I got an email from the Edinburgh International Film Festival saying they were going to be celebrating Highlander, and it was the 30th anniversary. And they were going to have Clancy Brown coming. He plays the Kurgan, for people that don't know, the baddie in the film. And Clancy Brown had distanced himself quite a lot from Highlander. He just didn't have a great experience with the producers back in 1985. And so the chance of getting him was incredible. And I live, as I say, I live in Edinburgh. I'm 20 minutes away from the cinema that we're going to be doing the event. So that really is, the long answer, I think, to your question is the opportunity arose to interview someone who really I shouldn't have been able to interview because he probably wouldn't have responded to emails. He might have done, but I don't think he would have done to some random person in Scotland. And so I got to speak to him. So I got maybe a 20-minute interview with him and maybe a 5-minute on the red carpet. And it sort of took off from there, really.
Brilliant. I remember the Kurgan being one of the most terrifying parts of that film when I watched it. There was something about him that was just... he kind of stole the film from right out from under everyone's noses.
Absolutely. Yeah, he's a fantastic character. And Clancy Brown just does such an amazing job bringing him to life. And he manages to go from... I mean, I think the character that ends up on the screen is, as he says, a little bit more of a... I think it was him that said it, more of a cackling villain, or it might have been the writer of the original script, Gregory Wyden, that might have said that. But there's a little bit of that. He's a little bit heightened, isn't he? I think that's a good word for it. But he does it well. And he was kind of told to do that, but he does it very well.
The thing about Tremors and Highlander is that it feels like they are, although they're not identical by any means, they sort of have that similar thing where a lot of people have a lot of affection for them. Cultish classics, if you like.
Yeah, that's it. And I suppose that must be something. I mean, I've never really sat down and I kind of analysed my tastes in film, or I don't know, just my view on the world. I don't really sit down and analyse it that much, and the films that I enjoy lots of different films. I mean, The Third Man is kind of my favourite film, which is about as far away from Tremors as you can get. But I guess if it's well written and it's well directed and well acted, or at least one or two of those things, then it's something that it's going to have a fan base, and I'm going to probably enjoy it. So yeah, and I think there's just this. Strangely enough, those two films, Tremors and Highlander, are both kind of difficult to categorize as well. I mentioned there earlier about Tremors being kind of this sci-fi comedy, western romance, whereas Highlander is kind of a action, fantasy, romance,
period drama.
Yeah, kind of with humor, and it's sort of difficult to categorize. So there's clearly something, and I guess as someone, if you're writing about something, it's sort of nice to be able to have different aspects you can focus on. And if it was just a melodrama or just a comedy or a romance, that's fine. But maybe it's harder to as I say, kind of interrogate that or come at it from different angles if you're just focusing on one tone. So yeah, there's something there that appeals to me.
Yeah. I'm going to have to stop the podcast. I'm going to have to edit this podcast and go back to the bit where you were talking about discovering another book about Highlander, and then I'll just drop myself in saying there can only be one when you were talking about the books. It's going to niggle me for the rest of the podcast that I didn't say that straight away. I missed a golden opportunity there.
Well, me too. I should have said it as well.
Don't worry, it'll work in post. It won't sound odd at all.
Okay.
Yeah. How long did it take you to write this book? Because you talked about Tremors being like 3 years, and this, whilst I was reading this, I was thinking, God, my God, you've interviewed so many people for this. There's so much detail in here, right down to extras and people. It's a brilliant breadth. You talked to Clancy Brown and you talked to Christopher Lambert, and then you also talked to the guys who were getting dressed up and running around pretending to be Highlanders and growing beards and whatnot. So how long did it take in total?
I guess it must have taken about 4 years.
Wow.
Which, yeah, is quite a long time, isn't it, when you think about it? Because, I started in 2016 with that first interview with Clancy. And then, but it wasn't a constant. I wasn't doing that every night. So I think the interviews certainly took a long time to get. So once you've got, let's say, Clancy, you're then trying to get Christopher Lambert, and he took a while. And actually, I was meant to interview in about a week after Clancy, funnily enough, because they were doing another special event in London as well as the one in Edinburgh. But when I got down there, his mum wasn't well, Christopher's mum, so that just didn't happen. So I'd flown down and flew back up that night with nothing, and it took another year maybe to get him. And the same with Russell Mulcahy. Spoke to him very briefly. He was in a taxi in South Africa, I think, filming, and spoke to him in the back of. Spoke to him in the taxi, and he said, "Oh yeah, phone me, email me." He is a very busy man, and it took another maybe year, 18 months to speak to him. So all these things were just taking a while. So I suppose probably the first couple of years were just trying to get interviews together, and then probably another, I don't know, maybe a year writing and editing. But yeah, so it wasn't every night of my life, thankfully. But I guess like anything, once you get closer to publication date, it all ramps up a bit, and you're just spending more time on it and just trying to make it the best it can be. But it was really important to me to get as many interviews as I could, because I just think if you're going to do it. This could be the only. I mean, I've said there's another book on Highlander, but mine was very different. This is sort of 300 and something pages. Might be the last book on Highlander. Who knows? Great if someone else comes along and has a go. But everybody's geting older.
Or are they?
Yes, exactly. Well, I mean, yeah, and so I think if you're going to do it, do your best, of course. And I'm sure, of course, everybody does when they do these things. Sure. But if you have a bit more time, for me, it was just obvious to spend that trying to track down people like the guys from Queen, who did take probably about 2 years to get Roger Taylor and Brian May, because I started emailing them, and they were always touring the world, and I just couldn't get them. Their agent was very nice, but just couldn't get them. And then the pandemic happened, and they were available. So it did happen in the end. So
silver linings to pandemics there.
Bizarrely, yeah.
That chapter was brilliant. I loved the story of Queen, because I remember listening to Queen when they were doing their sort of Dungeons and Dragons albums, and the sort of more fantasy based stuff. And then Kind of Magic was always felt like, well, you chronicle it in your book, it was a sort of post Live Aid new direction for them, really. And I remember reading somewhere Russell Mulcahy talking about Freddie Mercury being a really powerful sort of like insisting that this would be a great movie and all the rest of it. He was really enthusiastic about the project.
Yeah, I mean, there was a little bit of confusion, or maybe not confusion, but like anything, this sort of thing, you know, there are different stories going around about who has been approached first, and was it Queen or was it someone else, and so that was another reason that I really wanted to speak to them, was to try and I mean, I'm a fan. I love Queen. I've loved them since A Kind of Magic came out. Anyway, I remember that being on, and you know, just going into shops and things when it came out. I mean, I'm not a huge Queen fan in that I don't actually own all their albums or anything,
Right.
but you know, it's Queen, so you've got to. Yeah, the chance to speak to them would be amazing. So yeah, so I just wanted to try and find out the facts, really. So, but yeah, I got a chance to speak to them, and as you say, Freddie was very keen on the film. He saw potential in it, and agreed to be part of it, and they all got really involved in it and wrote a song and just made it something really special.
It was funny. Was it John Deacon who wrote the song that's on the radio? And he's like, "Oh bloody hell!" You know, no one listens to the song on the radio.
That's right. There's a song in the one on the radio and in the jukebox. I think it was in the pub in the New York bar. Yeah, just very lucky to get to speak to those guys, and I just wanted the fans. The other thing I had in the back of my mind, I suppose, as well, was I wanted fans of Highlander and also fans of Queen to try and to learn something new. That was another thing I obviously, well, I say obviously, but I definitely wanted, because why do something like this if you're just going to rehash what's on the internet? There's a lot. I think if you're a Highlander fan and you don't want to spend the money on this book, yes, you could go online actually and have a Google and you find out lots of different things. But what I wanted to do, you mentioned speaking to extras. I wanted to do that. I wanted to go to people who were on the set that you've never heard from before, and you probably will never hear from again, and find out what it was like being the stand-in for Sean Connery, what it was like getting fish for the scene where fish fall out of Christopher Lambert's kilt. Yeah, just a slightly maybe unusual person to interview, but just a nice little story that adds to the magic, I suppose.
You get a real sense of, like, I think even if you weren't a fan of Highlander, although I mean obviously that fans of Highlander are going to be your main audience, but it's just fascinating to me to read about people having sort of just how a film is made, you know, just all the different people involved and all the different, you know, I mean, I've just read The Devil's Candy, who actually is probably going to be in an episode that comes out before this one. And Bonfire of Vanities is not, you know, it's by no means a great film, like far from it. And yet it's still fascinating how that film got made, you know. And so I think
I've got that book on the shelf actually ready to read at some point when I get round to it.
My episode will be the inciting incidents that gets you into it.
Well, I just love collecting these sorts of books. I mean, that's another reason you asked to kind of why maybe did I want to write this book. It's also just because I'm fascinated by filmmaking, I'm kind of glad you said you don't have to be a Highlander fan really, because I think if you're just interested in filmmaking, or maybe, I don't know, British culture, that's maybe going a bit far, but certainly what was happening in the industry. I mean, there's a lot in there about Thorn EMI, which is a production studio that doesn't exist now. But there's a book, but only came out when I was writing mine. There's a book dedicated to Thorn EMI now, but there wasn't before that. And even if people read this book all about a film studio that now doesn't exist, I think I've got some things in my book that aren't in the other books. I spoke to people who worked there, and that's touching on what was happening in the industry at the time. So I do think I'm always, there's a funny thing about what you call yourself, what I call myself when it comes to what I do. And people sometimes say that, and even just filling in forms, sometimes you've got to write, what are you? You know, are you a journalist or an author or whatever? And I guess I suppose I am an author. I mean, I've written a couple of books, but I also wonder sometimes, a lot of things I read, they have interviews with film historians, and I sort of think, am I a film? And it's not just to make myself sound grander or anything, but I think, well, I'm writing about film history. Do I count as a film historian? I don't actually know the answer to that. I think I sort of am, but that's kind of what I enjoy doing, is just delving into history, going into the archives. I went down to the BFI and the BBFC, who do all the film classifications. I'm sure people who listen to this will know all this, but and went into their archives and sort of dug things out that people probably haven't since, well, ever really. You know, things like what people said about when Highlander came out on video, VHS in the UK. I think one person wrote in to complain that it should be a video nasty. And so, you know, who's going to know? You just wouldn't know that unless you went into the archive, because it's not online, I don't think. But yeah, so I might be. I like to think it's sort of excavating, to put maybe too grand a term on it, excavating the history of British cinema in a way. But I think that's part of the fun, and hopefully people, you don't have to be a Highlander fan to read this book. And if you are, you'll hopefully learn something else about the industry and just some of the people that worked in it and what was going on around about it. You know, because I also had to kind of tone that stuff down.
Right.
Because I did worry that it was getting too boring. And I stopped myself a couple of times because I thought there's only so much people want to read about the goings on in the boardroom of a studio in 1984 or 5. And I'm sure lots of people, I would sort of like to read a bit more if I was reading someone else's book, but at the same time, you kind of have to keep the story moving along, don't you? And so that was a difficult one. And a lot of it is self-editing and thinking, do people want to know this? Is this too boring? Have I just told people too much about the canteen at Thorney Am I or whatever? So yeah, it's a juggling act, but it is sort of telling a story. I think it's sort of trying to have a narrative running through the book and have almost like mini cliffhangers, isn't it? And hopefully keep people reading, but at the same time, you're just telling the story of it's just a film at the end of the day. But there's all the people around about it that put their heart and soul into it is fascinating.
Absolutely. I thought that whole thing about, I mean, I'm always interested in these films that they turn up in our lives as if they're just, you know, fait accompli. They're just there, completed, made, perfect, or not so perfect, depending, and you watch them, and then you read a book like yours, and you find out about how many drafts of the script there were, how many permutations, and every single point there's an alternative universe where it could have been a different actor in a different role, or it could have been or Christophe Lambert could have jumped off a building and killed himself, which is that's one of the best stories. I thought that was hilarious. Why would you just think, I'm gonna jump off a building in order to not have to do the stairs?
So that one, he was on the roof of Silver Cup Studio in New York, and the production team had set up this giant mattress, basically a blow up mattress for the stuntmen in case someone fell on it. And Christopher Lambert was filming his scene, climbed up the side with his sword, and decided to jump off. I think it was at lunch. No, it couldn't have been. I thought it was lunchtime. I think it was maybe just they were coming to an end at 1 a.m. or something, and he decided to jump off. And I can't remember now if someone shouted to him, "Don't do it," but he did it. And that was the fascinating thing, because there's different versions of that story, and that's another reason to try to speak to lots of different people who were there, because because you know, if I just listen to Christopher, now his version of the story could be true. Let's face it. I mean, maybe it is, but there are one or two other people that don't quite agree with him, and I suppose that's the thing with any kind of documenting of again, I'm sort of using these grander terms, talking about history, but something that happened in the past, or even something that happens now. If you've only got one person, that story goes down forever as that's what happened. Whereas I'm kind of quite happy that I've now got 2 or 3 people saying, well, I think this happened. And it's up to the reader in a way to sort of piece together what actually did happen. And sometimes I'm being a little bit, I'm trying to be polite to the to one person and give them the benefit of the doubt, because I don't want to be too harsh on them. But
who are you being polite about?
Well, I think because there are different views, I don't feel it's quite my place to say he was wrong or that person's right. So I suppose it's more just that case of trying to be polite, as in saying, well, okay, maybe he's right, but these other people say he's not. So what do you think? You're kind of winking at the reader, I suppose, or nudging them a little bit, but.
Dude, there's so many huge personalities on that set as well. You've got, you've already got Russell Mulcahy coming out of music videos. You've got Sean Connery earning, what's it, like a million for like 6 days work or something?
I think it ended up like a million and a half.
And you've got Clancy Brown turning up, and he's quite young. He's like in his 20s, isn't he? He's got something of an attitude to him. And like Christopher Lambert is the sort of, seems like the calm sort of when he's not jumping off buildings when he shouldn't be, he seems like the calm, nice guy that everyone has a kind word for.
Yeah, no, totally. Like any film set, I suppose there were, like you say, different personalities, and Clancy, I think, was at that age and that stage in his career where he was not earning perhaps as much as other people, and maybe just wasn't treated as well because he was the third lead in a way, wasn't it? I suppose, yes, of course, Christoph was the lead, and Sean was almost a glorified cameo. But I think watching it now, Clancy, of course, is up there with those guys. But in the eyes of the producers and the money men, I suppose he wasn't. So yeah, I think he was, as I mentioned in the book, or as Clancy says, he was left to, everyone else was kind of flown up, I think, to Scotland, and had really great treatment and 5-star hotels, and Clancy had to come up on the train himself and got in at midnight, and didn't know where to go, and had to stop a policeman to ask where the local hostel was. So yeah, I think if that's the start of your experience on a project, it's, yeah, where's it going to go from there? And he's a really nice guy to speak to. Just a really smart, funny guy, and I think although he's honest and that he says things about the producers, he says what he thinks. I also think there's things he's still not said because maybe he could get sued or whatever. But I think he's still been kind of polite in a way, and there's probably more he could say. But how much do you want to say? I mean, I won't say who it was. It was nothing negative, but one of the people I spoke to did say they wanted to read the transcript before I published it, or certainly what I had written for the book based on that interview, because they didn't want the fans to be reading negative things about the film they love. And that is another, just a sort of interesting aspect, I suppose, of writing about these films, or maybe any film, but I guess now, if you were writing something now about the new Bond film and it was an official book, I think it would be interesting. I've not read the new book on the new film, but of course it's going to be a bit more sanitized and a bit more, everybody's really close to it. People could get, I keep saying, sued, but people could get sued if they say the wrong thing. Everybody's just been a bit careful because it's a multi-million-dollar franchise, whereas something that's 40 years old, people are a bit more honest, but the fans are still fans, and fans love it. And they don't necessarily want to hear. Some people do. I did get a complaint about my Tremors book saying it wasn't warts and all. Mm. And they wanted to know more about fights on set and things that went wrong. And the truth of the matter is, nobody told me about about fights on set. And that's either because they didn't happen or because they were just being polite again. So yeah, so somebody, at least one person did say, look, can you just run it past me? Because I don't want the fans to know or hear about things that, if I've said anything that's negative, as in this person I was interviewing, please can you kind of tone it down or take it out. So I think with that interview there was maybe just one thing, and it was about someone else. I'm sort of just alluding to things, but it really wasn't anything that ruined your enjoyment of the film or the book, and it was more just maybe someone that did something that maybe wasn't entirely professional, but we don't need to know these things. So I suppose what I'm saying is there was nothing that I can think of that I took out. I mean, sometimes again, and people, maybe you've had other people say this, but sometimes you are just being a bit cautious about certain comments made because they could be misconstrued, or it's something that is, I'm not saying anything really happened illegal, but if something did happen that was illegal, you're like, oh, I don't know if I should be saying that. Maybe I'll get into trouble. But that's the same with any sort of journalism, isn't it? It's you're just trying to be as honest as possible and put across what someone has told you, but at the same time just be mindful of, is that absolutely true? Or if you publish that, is that a scandal? People are still alive. Responsible, yeah, that's a good word for it. So, but that's something I never really had to think about before I wrote these books. I was doing a bit of journalism on the side, but I'm not a trained journalist. And so I would do sometimes interviews just about the new film that had come out. And again, everybody was being quite cautious about what they were saying, or just very positive. So I suppose that's something I learned writing these books, was just that, especially with my first book, which I self-published, I was just very, very careful about not wanting to get into trouble. But then, as I mentioned, nobody really said anything that was too controversial.
It's a tough balancing act, because you always,
Yeah.
I mean, I've been in interviews before where you're kind of wary that if you push it, you might get a better story, or the interview could stop right there.
Yes.
You don't want to give this just the sanitized version. You don't want to. You do want to go into areas that are difficult, because that's a better story. But you can shoot yourself in the foot if you're too aggressive about that. One thing that I sort of, as I was reading it, I was thinking, you haven't pushed too far there, was when you interviewed the dialogue coach of Christophe Lambert, when you sort of, because they have some blood on their hands, right?
Well, I approached that person, and just the response I got was they weren't interested in speaking. So I mean, right. Sometimes you do, like you're saying with any interview, in an interview situation, you might nudge things. Sometimes you might nudge things when you get a no, like I did with David Yip, who's another section of the book. David Yip is a British actor,
the Chinese detective,
and he was in was it Temple of Doom?
That's right. Yeah, he's Indy. It's the end of our adventure, Indy.
Yeah, he's a great actor. I'm a huge fan. I'd love to have spoken to him. Anyway, if you've not read the book, the story is that he was cast allegedly as another immortal in this film, in a sequence that was actually ended up being cut from the film. And so someone said to me, "Oh yeah, and David Yip." Now I can't remember now if I'd read that somewhere else, or if someone told me in an interview. But anyway, the rumor is that David Yip was cast. So I tried to get in touch with David Yip for an interview to talk about this scene, but his agent came back and said, "David," the wording was something like, "David doesn't want to talk about," or "David was not in the film," something like that, which is true. He wasn't in the film, but I was trying to uncover the fact that was he actually approached to be in the film. So in the book, I kind of just I just lay out what I know and theorize a little bit about was he because one of the members of the team who was doing the makeup is adamant that he was there on set with David Yip, because he says that he often used to get called the Chinese detective because he looked a little bit like David Yip. So that feels to me quite a strong confirmation that David Yip was there. But then his sort of David Yip's person said he wasn't in the film. And it's like, yeah, well, yes, I know he wasn't. But so that's a fascinating story, which I hope someone else maybe uncovers sometime. But I couldn't get an interview with David Yip. So I tried.
One of the appeals of the film, I think, I mean, like, I remember when I saw it and I was 14, I thought it was one of the best films I'd ever seen. And I thought it was like, oh, it's so well directed. And then, like, as I got older and I matured a bit and I went back and watched it again, I thought, oh my God, how did I ever like this? It's so over-directed. It's so over the top. And it's just like a swinging pendulum. And now when I rewatched it after reading your book, I watched it, I thought, this is so much fun. And even the stuff that I, in my sort of maturity felt, I just used scare quotes for the listeners. In my maturity, I thought didn't work, Christophe Lambert's accent and all that sort of stuff. I just find so that it's part of the fun of it, For instance, there's one quote that I use all the time, which is, "You talk funny, Nash. Where you from?" And in my head, he replies, "Lots of different places." But of course, if you're rewatching the film, he just says lots of different places in a relatively normal accent. But in my head, it's so, it's crazy.
Yeah, it's a funny film, isn't it? And more in funny, peculiar, and just funny, haha. And it's very self-aware, and I think that's partly what makes it work, because it's such a ludicrous idea that if they were to just do it deadly serious, then I just don't think it would work as well. And it is, and I think, I mean, I can't speak for every fan, of course, but I feel a lot of fans see the flaws, know that it's ludicrous, know that the special effects are off their time, know that the accents are, it's just an ongoing joke with the accents and the whole different actors playing complete yeah, it's
Haggish.
it's a bonkers film, and I actually said to Russell Mackay, it shouldn't work, but it does.
Yeah.
And he laughed at that and said, yeah, that should be on the poster. It shouldn't work, but it does. Yeah, it's just a crazy film. So I think that's the beauty of it, and that a lot of fans, or most fans, probably you just have to embrace the craziness and go with it. And I don't know. I was just going to say something along the lines of, sort of like we were talking about earlier about, does every film deserve a book written about it? I don't know. I'm asking myself that question. I don't actually know the answer, but I think there's something about, in many ways, I think they do, actually, because unless it's just a really boring film that, maybe even boring films deserve it, but I just think it's just fascinating to sort of explore even films that are, I suppose some people have said to me, and they're quite honest and open about the fact that they do not like Highlander and they just think it's rubbish. And actually, I agree with them, because in a way it is rubbish, but at the same time it's amazing and it's genius. So I don't know, there's just something about this film. I'm not quite answering that other question really about should every film have a book made, but it's just saying, if enough people love it, if there's an interesting story there, then I think people. There's so many books that I see coming out that I would never think I want to read.
Mm.
And then I think, actually, yeah, that's a brilliant idea. There's a book that came out recently about, I'm a big Doctor Who fan, and there's a book that came out about, I don't know if you know the kind of history of Doctor Who, but really there was a period when it was not on the television. And someone has written a book just recently about the period from, I think it's 1997 or 8 up until 2003, when the series had a TV movie made in America and then had come back, or had been commissioned again by the BBC in 2003. And that's a period of time which I'd read a lot about, and I didn't think I needed to read any more. And then it was announced this book was coming out, interviewing all the people that were there, and I thought, that sounds amazing. And I've just finished reading it, and it's fantastic. But it's funny, isn't it, that people if you can find just this interesting approach to something and make it readable, then brilliant. That's a skill. Yeah.
My reaction, because I'm obviously, for the podcast as well, I'm looking at a lot of books and I'm reading a lot of things. And so on my Amazon page, it came like recommended reads. It came up your book on Highlander, and I just thought, oh yeah, I've got to read that. it was a slam dunk, and it was kind of
that's good.
It kind of made me think, wow, hasn't somebody already done this? In the sense that it felt like such a good idea that it kind of surprised me that it had taken this long to have that sort of oral history approach that you've done, and it's so good that you've sort of conserved that, because as you say, in a couple more decades there might not be anybody left to tell those stories.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, I thank you for that, and I agree. Yeah, when I did Tremors, within maybe a year or so of it being published, at least 3 people had died that I spoke to. One of whom, Marcia Strassman, who was in the Tremors TV series, just was a lovely person to speak to. As well as just talking about Tremors, she just had an amazing career in American TV, and she was in things like MASH and Welcome Back, Kotter, and lots of different things. And she loved British television. I'm going off on a tangent here, but she loved British TV. And at that time, Peter Capaldi was the Doctor. And she was talking about loving Peter Capaldi, as well as finding it slightly odd that so many British actors were going over to America and doing so well. And just, yeah, so that's a whole other chat really about people you interview, I think, and people that you bond with. But she did say at the end of the call, please, call back sometime and it'd be great to have a chat. And I didn't, because why? Of course, I wouldn't be thinking, oh well, maybe she'll die in the next year, and she did. And I'm at the time I was sad about that. I only spoke to her for an hour, but it's just sometimes you bond with people, and I just think, oh, that was so sad. I wish I'd spoken to her more. But
I think if you have obviously it depends on the levels of stardom and levels of busyness, and people who are working a lot at the moment. I don't have much time to talk about things in the past and everything else, but people who have put work into something, I find that they are really keen to talk about it. And that's why people become actors, people become writers and directors. They do it for the work. And so if they find people who are interested and are sort of keeping the flame alive, so to speak, I find a lot of people are very open to that.
Yeah, and I think I've been very lucky. I benefited from that, of course, doing these books, and because I've never, people listening to this may or may not know that the way interviews tend to happen most of the time is that the person doing the interviewing tends not to pay for interviews. I think that sometimes I've spoken to people about what I'm doing and they're surprised to hear that, or the fact that Kevin Bacon might give up half an hour or Christopher Lambert an hour and a half to talk about their work. And these are famous people that we see on the TV and we've got to pay to watch their films. I think sometimes people think, oh, do you pay them? How much? And no, I mean, I think only one person ever that I can think of asked to be paid. Nothing to do with these books, and it didn't happen. But
yeah, note to journalists: never pay anybody for an interview.
I mean, sometimes people don't want to talk, and it is about time. I think. I think most of the time. Sometimes it's just very difficult to find people, and I'll email somebody, and it just bounces back because the email doesn't exist anymore. Or sometimes it's just impossible to track somebody down. Sometimes they'll come back and yeah, they are busy, they're maybe filming something, and then sometimes you forget that you emailed them and then that interview just doesn't happen. So there are reasons why they don't happen, but yeah, I would say 99% of the time if I get through to somebody, they say yes, and I'm very lucky, and I hope I do them justice as well. Of course, that's the other thing, you just want to do them justice and make sure their story is told the way they told you.
Having rewatched the film sort of for, you must have watched the film over and over again when you were writing the book. Yeah. What sort of stuff sort of stood out and survived for you? And, was there anything that you sort of learned in that process that made you appreciate the film in a different way from before?
Well, I think the thing, I suppose, that probably stuck with me, that probably appealed to me about the film the first time I saw it, but I didn't really appreciate that that's what it was the human, the love story at the centre of it. And because when I went to see that film, I can't remember exactly what I was thinking at the time, but I was going to see the Crow, which is kind of an action fantasy film, and Highlander is basically that, and it's fighting and it's people killing each other, and although it's not time travel, it takes place in different time periods and its adventures. So I thought that what I loved about it was that, and that's what maybe kept me interested. But while I watched it again and again, what I realised was it's actually, for me anyway, the love story at the heart of it. And this, and I suppose it is a timeless love story in a way. And it is a bit cheesy, of course it is. And we've said already it's a little bit of a cheesy film and it's not perfect. But there's just something about that romance between Connor MacLeod and Heather, his wife. And it sounds a bit strange saying it in a way, but there's just something magical about that and special that grounds the film. I think I maybe say that in the book, but it grounds it in some sort of reality that we can recognise as human beings, because we've all hopefully, well, certainly experienced some sort of relationship or love, and then of course there comes the tragedy at some point inevitably, which none of us really want to think about. But poor Connor has had to deal with this for hundreds of years. He's had this. I'm getting a bit emotional just thinking about it now, but poor Connor.
And that amazing song as well. There's that amazing song, and the music with Michael Kamen brilliantly utilises. And I disagree with Roger Taylor. I think it's brilliantly orchestrated, that song. I think it's really.
I agree. And so that was the thing anyway. I suppose that just was hammered home every time I watched it, was just that romance and just how well Christopher Lambert does with it. Even though he is fighting against the accent thing, trying to do his best with English. I think he does well with his English, or his Scottish, I suppose. And what else? maybe just Russell Mulcahy's direction. More watching that again and again and having to think about it for when I spoke to him, you just realise what he was bringing to it, and the fact that he was fighting. Was he fighting? I don't know if he was sort of fighting against old school British film industry guys who were coming to it with this: we don't have rain inside, and we don't have hubcaps going past, and we don't film from 4 different angles in the same scene. So I guess Russell is the other thing in a way that really just became a bit more. But because he's in the film, that's well, he's in it literally. Actually, he's in a couple of scenes as a cameo, but he's also in the film because his talent, his skill, his is infused through that film. Of course, it's a Russell Mulcahy film. It looks like one of his music videos. So
which cameo does he play?
Well, he's in it. If you next time you watch it, when the Kurgan is driving down the street with Brenda in New York, there's a scene where he mounts the pavement and he knocks 2 people over, and one of them is Russell Mulcahy, just a brief second. And there's another scene when Brenda goes to the library, again in New York, and just as that scene starts, the camera sort of pans in, and on I think it's the right hand side, there's a curly haired blonde man, and that's Russell just standing there. So things like that, I suppose, watching it over and over, I noticed these things which I had never really noticed. So that's the beauty of rewatching films over and over and over and over again, is that you do see things, and then you can say to him, "Did I see you getting hit by a car in that film?" He's like, "Yeah."
Was he the first kind of that sort of music video generation to then make a film? Because I know afterwards we had people like, well, we had big directors like Martin Scorsese doing John Landis doing a Michael Jackson, and I think Scorsese did a Michael Jackson, and we had David Fincher who did Madonna, and then was back and forth between music videos and movies. But I wonder if Mulcahy was like the first of that generation.
Well, someone will probably correct us, or correct me if I say yes, he was, but he was very close to it. I know Steve Barron was another music video director who did a few films. I spoke to him for something else, and I can't remember what film it was, but that he had made it, because I wasn't interviewing him about that. But yes, he was certainly one of the first, and certainly Russell's. I mean, there was so many interesting things to get into this book about. Certainly his MTV story, which I loved writing about. The fact that his video was the first video on MTV. And that's just a brilliant fact for something like this, isn't it? To have that up your sleeve is like, did you know the guy who directed this film, he was the guy that did the Buggles video, killed the radio star. And I was also just lucky about things like Live Aid happening. At the same time they were filming Highlander, one of the people I spoke to went home and watched Live Aid on the telly, and Queen were on Live Aid and then ended up doing Highlander. So there's these kind of nice little connections which made it more interesting for me to write as well, because I had to try and work out how to because I think entering a chapter, I mentioned there about trying to have little cliffhangers. I think also entering a chapter is a challenge as well, and it's a fun challenge, because you don't want everyone to just come in and say, and then next this is what happened. So I hope I got it right. I mean, I like all these things, you're just doing it yourself and you're hoping for the best. And I did have the publisher was kind of my editor, but it never gave me any. And I had some friends read it as well. Just to mention in passing, some friends read the book and gave me some amazing feedback on it. But yeah, so lots. I've gone off on a slight tangent again, but yeah, it's easy to do when you start talking about these things, because it was just such a fun thing to work on. It's fun to do with all these amazing, and it wouldn't be the same if people didn't speak to you about it, if people didn't do the interviews. I think I've read many books, I'm sure you have more than me, because you do this podcast, and you can of course write a book about a film without interviewing people that were there, and you can use old interviews, or you can just put your own thoughts about a film into a book, and that's all perfectly valid. But a lot of the time that can be quite dry. Not every time, of course. And so I was just very lucky. I was just coming back once again. I was so lucky that people wanted to speak to me, and that they could, because it's their story. All I'm doing is joining the dots, really. In a way, that's kind of what I'm doing, is just trying to make it hopefully interesting for you to keep reading, to get to the next person that tells an interesting story. And also just trying to be careful not to maybe overwhelm people with just quotes. Although I think maybe the next book I do is going to be more more of an oral history, whereas I give more space over to them with paragraphs of quotes rather than just me chopping them up a little bit. So
Nicholas Pileggi's Wise Guys, which was filmed as Goodfellas, is a brilliant example of how you can write an entire book which is entirely made up of quotations entirely, and yeah, it reads like a novel. That thing flies. That's such a great book. I one of the greatest experiences in the cinema was watching the first Highlander. One of the worst experiences in the cinema was watching Highlander 2, which I remember the cinema was absolutely packed. I don't know how Highlander had become this sort of popular thing that everybody in Barrow in Furness suddenly wanted to go and see Highlander 2, the quickening. But the thing was, the cinema was packed. For some reason, I can't remember the details, my girlfriend and her mum came along. And
really,
yeah, I haven't, and yeah, my girlfriend coming along, I totally understand. I'm not sure why her mum came along, and I think it might have been me. I've got a feeling it was me going, "Oh, this is so good! You'll love it. This is such a good thing." And oh man, and I think that was the first film I ever really. No, it can't have been, but it was one of those. You know, when you go to the cinema when you're a kid and you love everything you see, and then at one point you go and you sit and you're watching a film and you're thinking, is this bad? Is this a bad film? I mean, does such a thing even exist? But boy, that was a stinker.
Yes, that's something when I started writing, I decided probably day one really was, before day one was, I'm not going to cover the sequels. Because yes, it's not, there are many fans. I know people now who I've met since writing the book. I know people who love Highlander 2, and I've tried to watch, I have watched it since, while writing the book and since writing it, and I've tried again and again, and I just don't enjoy it. I'm the same as you. But I can see that some people do. But no, I thought, what's the point in putting myself through pain watching things that I don't enjoy? Because there's probably something in, people talk these days about hate watching a TV show, and you watch it and then you slag it off on Twitter. That's fine, I suppose. I mean, it can be fun, but not having to write chapters and chapters about something. So yeah, I made a decision early on, just focus on the first film. And I have seen all the well, no, there's one of the the films I've still not finished. I think it's called The Source, Highlander The Source,
right? Which
is number 5, maybe.
Yeah.
Which nobody really talks about, but no, and people. But I do dedicate a chapter trying to talk about what happened next, and I was very lucky once again to get an interview with somebody who was involved in Highlander 2. I think he was one of the producers and helped with the funding, who just gave some time to talk about that. So I think that's something else that fans have maybe not heard before. But yeah, I wasn't going to spend my time.
Life's too short.
Hate watching, hate writing. Who wants to do that?
Hate writing is going way too far. Dedicating a month or two of your life to write a chapter about it is way too much.
Definitely, yeah. But people have asked me. Many people have asked me on Twitter and on Facebook or whatever. So when are you writing a book on Highlander 2? Probably never is the answer, unless someone pays me lots and lots of money.
I'd say definitely never. I think even that probably, if somebody offers me loads of money, that's not going to happen.
I would read it though, because I think there is definitely an interesting story there. But I do sort of think that now both producers are dead. One of the sort of remaining producer sadly died recently this year after the book had come out. And I didn't get to speak to him for this book, so it's not like that really affected this book. But I think he has lots of stories to tell. But I don't know. Anyway, no, I would read it because I think it's an interesting tale. But I think something like Highlander 3 or 4 is going too far. I don't know if I would read those books, but we shall see.
You make the point that doesn't three get better? And I mean, I haven't seen anything after 1 and 2. I haven't seen the TV series either, which again was, I mean, you make a point in the book. I think somebody you interview says this, that even the first film wasn't commercially a huge success, and so why it spawned so many sequels and so many TV shows and things like that is kind of a little bit of a mystery.
Yeah, that was the chap that I spoke to. I'm trying to remember his name. It's gone out of my head, I'm afraid. But he was the kind of producer on the TV series, one of the producers on the TV series, and helped with the sequels. And he makes that point and just says, I don't really understand what was happening, because the first film didn't make a lot of money at the box office. It succeeded on video, and the sequels never did that well at the cinema, and yet they kept making them. So there was clearly lots of money being made on VHS and DVD. And it was Christopher Lambert, I think, who said the third one, he felt guilty going to press launches and things for the second one. He said to people, don't go and see Highlander 2 if you think it's a sequel to Highlander, because it isn't. And of course people were saying to him, but it is, because it's called Highlander 2. And he's like, yeah, but it's not really. So, and he was getting told off by the producer and the PR people. He said, you can't say that. You can't say don't go and see it. And he thinks Highlander 3 is the proper sequel. And he's probably right, but even Highlander 3 is not that brilliant. But there will be fans who think it's better than, it's their favourite, I'm sure.
Every film is somebody's favourite film.
Absolutely.
There's somebody somewhere who loves every single film. So
definitely, and that's great.
Yeah, exactly. To be celebrated, it's the weave and woof of the rich tapestry we call life. That's what I think anyway. But there are occasionally rumors about a potential sort of reboot, right?
Yeah, well, since I wrote the book, the rumor is it's sort of, what's the term, solidified? Can a rumor be solid? I'm not sure, but it sort of appears that it's actually going to happen now, although anything could happen. I mean, what the problem with the reboot, both the positive and the negative, is that Chad Stahelski, who directs the John Wick films, loves Highlander, and Chad wants to bring back Highlander. That's fantastic, and I think he'll do amazing things. The look, whatever you think of the John Wick films, I think if you watch them, you have to appreciate the style that he's got when it comes to gunplay, which sounds a bit odd to say in certainly in this country where we don't really like guns, but as a film, as a fiction, as a fantasy world, he does amazing things with gunplay. So I think what he could do with swordplay, I think it could be incredible. So brilliant, he wants to do it. But the downside is the John Wick films are so huge that Lionsgate, I think it is, that produce them, just want more of them. So Chad keeps having to make new ones. And I don't know Chad, so I've not spoken to him. I'm sure he's happy with that. And certainly money-wise, it must be incredible. But I wonder if creatively it's a little bit... it means he can't really move on to other things. So Highlander is sort of stuck in this weird place where it was recently announced that Henry Cavill is going to be Connor in the reboot. So that's something big. Not actually announced something which hasn't happened before. But I think the new John Wick is... Anyway, we're not talking about John Wick. But so, yes, I think it will happen. Fingers crossed. Certainly it's the closest it's ever been. And I think the right people are probably involved in it, because just from what I've seen of their work. And Henry Cavill, I watched the first episode of The Witcher recently, which is on Netflix, and I watched it after he was announced. And what Henry Cavill does with swords and that is incredible as well. Just the fight sequences and the way those are put together. So could be a match made in heaven. And I know I sort of know a little bit the guys at Davis Panzer who produced the original Highlander, and I really only got to know them after the book came out. And I know that they're committed to just this being the best film. They're loyal to the fans. They want this to be for fans of the original film. They want to respect them, but also they appreciate that there needs to be a whole new audience that comes to it, and people that have never heard of it before. So I think that's the battle, really, isn't it? It's trying to you don't have to appeal to the old fans, because I think there are a lot of them. But I think if every Highlander fan went to the cinema to see the new Highlander film, that wouldn't be a blockbuster. That would just be, it would do quite well in the opening night, because there are not millions. There are millions of people who like Highlander if it's on the telly. But a card-carrying Highlander fan, there probably aren't millions who would. Well, millions have not bought my book, so that maybe they will. But
after this podcast, they will.
Of course they will. So anyway, yes, I think the film will. I like to think it'll happen. It's certainly closer than it's ever been, and it's absolutely fine if it does, because the original is always there, and we can always just put it on the Blu-ray or stream it off Amazon or whatever.
Also, the very concept itself is so elastic in the sense that you have literally the entirety of sort of history. I mean, I guess you have to keep Connor MacLeod, because then it wouldn't be Highlander. It wouldn't be, you have to have that root in the sort of in that character. But from that point in history and geography until the present day, you could literally, you could even put it into the future if you wanted to, because of the nature of the concept, the immortals,
Totally, and I do mention the book and spoke to Christopher Lambert about it. I think that there should. I'd love to see it as a Netflix series, actually, or Amazon or whoever, just because of exactly what you said. There's this huge canvas which you can build this world. And so many different characters which you can take from the film, reinvent them, who all have their amazing backstories, and all these other immortals that we've never seen. So yeah, you could have multiple seasons, you could have spin-offs, you could have everything. So I hope I'd like to go and see the film, of course, and I'm sure it'll be great. But it's a universe, really, like John Wick. Actually, I know that, go back to John Wick, that they are doing a prequel TV series, and they're talking about doing a spin-off film with Ana de Armas, which would be amazing based on what she did in No Time to Die. But I think with Highlander, it feels like just common sense that you would say, okay, we'll do this first film. I think the original plan was to do it as a trilogy of Highlander films. But the idea of having a spin-off series and novels and podcasts, it feels like a no-brainer, really.
Brilliant. And then everybody will buy your book, obviously, because it'll be seen as a foundational text.
Of course, millions will buy it.
The Bible of Highlander, they'll call it. Listen, Jonathan, one last question, which is, what film book would you recommend for our listeners?
The book that there's quite a few. I've already mentioned a few today. One which I would recommend is the book on Don Simpson, which I think is the Don Simpson and the Culture of Hollywood Excess. Is that what it's called? I wish I'd double-checked it before I came on, but I think that's what it's called, which came out quite a while ago now, maybe 15, 20 years ago. And as it sounds, it's about Don Simpson, the Hollywood producer.
It's called High Concept, Don Simpson and the Hollywood Culture of Excess. So you got the...
I was half-ish, right, yeah.
You got the sort of you got the after the colon.
Yes. And that one, now I've not read it for a long time, actually, but when you said that, that's the one that came to mind, because it's the one that's always stuck with me through the years. Just some of the amazing stories. As someone who's a fan of all these amazing Hollywood, these blockbusters like like Top Gun and the Con Air and The Rock and all these films that I know Don Simpson didn't work on. I think he died by, was it Con Air or The Rock? But anyway, he worked on all these amazing blockbusters, and just the stories that they tell in that book are fantastic, and they stuck with me ever since. I just remember one, I think it was on the set of Days of Thunder, where Don had taken a little bit too much cocaine, I think it was, and I'm sure he rips the door off the, what is it called, the trailer that Tom Cruise is in, I think, literally rips it off, and things like that stuck in my mind. And it's just a great insight into the insanity of Hollywood and these brilliant blockbusters that I certainly loved. I mean, back in the 90s, I just remember going to see things like The Rock and Con Air and Face Off and all these sorts of things. It was just that brilliant time. I miss those 90s action films. I know we've got great things now, but Marvel has sort of taken over, and I know that's another discussion, but I'd love to read more about those.
What are you saying about Marvel? Quick! This'll be the
love Marvel.
Be the quote.
Love Marvel.
But I'll sell this interview on.
Oh dear, but no, that book. Please read it if you've not. And even like you said about my book, kindly, you don't have to like Highlander to read the book. I think if you want to know about the film industry. Exactly the same with that one on Don Simpson. You don't have to be a fan of Days of Thunder. I'm sure there are lots of fans of that, but just read it. It's just fascinating, yeah.
Same guys who like Highlander too. Huge Days of Thunder heads. Although I think Days of Thunder, I have heard people a little bit like Miami Vice recently. It's sort of become a little bit of a hipster choice of like, no, actually, it's better than Top Gun. Yeah, I think one of the things about those 90s action movies is they were kind of all one-offs. They were like, I mean, I know they're going to make a Top Gun sequel now, but throughout the 80s, they made 80s, 90s, they kind of did one and done. I'm trying to think. Well, there were a couple. Well, Rambo and Rocky and those things were franchises, and so was one last one was Beverly Hills Cop. But Face Off, you didn't get a Face Off 2. You didn't get a Con Air 2. You didn't get a Rock 2. Those are quite major sort of action movies, which were potentially franchisable, as franchisable as Die Hard, which did get a franchise, of course.
Absolutely. I think Jerry Bruckheimer did he do Bad Boys, I think.
That's
I'm
right.
Not sure
yeah.
I'm not sure Don Simpson was on that one as well. And of course there were a couple of sequels to that. But no, you're right, absolutely. Most of them, they were kind of one and done. And I've long wanted to see Con Air 2, but at the same time I don't want to see Con Air 2 because I'm sure it'd be absolutely terrible. And the first one is just great. It's just fun. Just literally what people talk about, popcorn movies. Yeah, I remember going to see those films. I remember going to see actually Die Hard with a Vengeance, the Odeon Cinema here in Edinburgh, on the night of Sean Connery's birthday. I think it might have been his 60th birthday. And I remember, this is just an aside really, but his brother was holding a party for Sean Connery in the cinema, but Sean Connery wasn't there, but they were having a birthday party. That's just a bizarre memory that I have. And Sean Connery's brother used to live around the corner from me when I was writing the Highlander book. Sadly, he died just maybe 6 months ago or so. But I did mention him in passing while walking to the bus stop once. I'm writing a book on Highlander just to see what he would say. And he didn't really show much interest in it, sadly. I think I half thought maybe he would say, I'll just get you Sean's email, but he never did.
You've got to try, man. You've got to give it a go.
Exactly.
Yeah, I don't think Sean had an email.
No. He had people who did emails.
Listen, Jonathan, it's been wonderful talking to you, and thanks so much for giving me an opportunity to relive my childhood passion and then rediscover it anew. It's giving me license to like it again.
No, I saw you on Twitter. You've been watching it, and yeah, it's just well, we've spoken about it so many. We've said a lot about it, haven't we? But it's still just great fun to watch, I think. And
there are so many moments. As I was watching it, I was like, "Feel the stag," and I was doing all the, muttering a lot. Even, of course you are, when the prostitute comes in and
Candy, yeah. Actually, just to say, I did one of the people I couldn't get was the interview was the woman who did the choreography.
Oh,
bizarrely,
right.
There was choreography for that scene with Clancy and the sword when he's putting the sword together and he sort of runs it along his arms. Her name's going out of my head now, but she was a judge on Strictly Come Dancing here in the UK for a few years.
How the mighty have fallen.
Yeah, but she didn't email me back. So yeah, sometimes it happens. I don't know what she would have said really, because it must have been a few hours. But I think she was a friend of Russell Mulcahy. I seem to remember reading that somewhere. But
yeah, it sounds like maybe from the pop industry, perhaps.
Yes,
yeah.
She's very famous, but her name has just gone right out of my head. So, but no, I'm glad you enjoyed it. Of course, that's brilliant, and it's been fascinating, fun to talk about it. Thank you.
So that was my conversation with Jonathan Melville. His book, Kind of Magic, Making the Original Highlander, and it's a really great read. I recommend it for anybody who has even a passing interest in the film. His recommended book was High Concept, Don Simpson and the Hollywood Culture of Excess. So you can pick that up as well, and maybe I'll see if I can get Charles Fleming, the author, on the podcast as a guest in the future. Okay, all that's left is for me to thank Elliot Atkins for the music, Ali Harwood for the art, and until the next episode, take care.